Your Honor, as you can see from my evidence, my ex-wife is clearly too emotional and unstable to have primary custody of our daughter. The words hit me like ice water in the packed courtroom. Every eye turned toward me as Marcus's lawyer slid a manila folder across the judge's bench, his voice carrying that rehearsed tone of concerned authority that I'd learned to dread over the past 3 years. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I used to believe that love meant accepting less than you deserved. 3 years ago, I was Sarah Hoffman, married to a man who convinced me that my tears were weakness, my concerns were nagging, and my instincts were hysteria. Marcus had a gift for making me question my own reality, a talent he'd cultivated since we met at a medical conference, when I was 24 and fresh out of nursing school, full of dreams and optimism that he slowly, methodically chipped away. In the beginning, Marcus was everything I thought I wanted: successful, charming, confident in ways I'd never been. He was an attending physician at the hospital where I worked as a floor nurse, and when he noticed me, I felt chosen, special. He had a way of making you feel like the only person in the room when his attention was on you, and I was young enough to mistake intensity for love. "You're different from other women," he'd tell me during those early months of dating. "You actually listen. You're not constantly chattering about meaningless things." I took it as a compliment then, not recognizing it as the first step in teaching me that my voice should be smaller, quieter. The red flags were there from the start, but they were wrapped in romantic gestures and declarations of love. When he criticized my friends as shallow and a bad influence, I thought he was protecting me. When he suggested I didn't need to work so many extra shifts because he could take care of me, I thought he was being generous. When he got upset if I didn't answer his calls immediately, I thought it meant he loved me deeply. We married after 18 months of dating. I was 26, wearing my grandmother's dress, walking down the aisle toward a man who I thought would love me forever. In the wedding photos, I'm glowing with happiness, completely unaware that I was signing up for a masterclass in emotional manipulation. The changes started small. Marcus would make little comments about my appearance. "Are you sure you want to wear that? It's a bit tight, don't you think? Or maybe you should consider getting your hair done professionally more often." Always framed as concern, always delivered with a smile that made me question whether I was being too sensitive. He had opinions about everything. My friends were too dramatic. My family was too involved in our business. My coworkers were unprofessional. Gradually, my world shrank to fit his preferences. Sunday dinners with my parents became monthly, then holiday only. Girls' nights out became extinct. My voice, which had once been confident and clear during patient care, became hesitant and apologetic at home. "Why are you so defensive?" became his favorite response to any pushback. "I'm just trying to help you be better." When I got pregnant with Emma 3 years into our marriage, I thought it would change everything. I thought becoming parents would soften him, bring us closer together. Instead, it gave him new ammunition. Pregnancy hormones made me more emotional, more likely to cry when overwhelmed. Marcus documented every tear, every moment of vulnerability, building a mental case file he'd use against me years later. "You're being irrational," he'd say, when I worried about the baby or expressed concerns about our relationship. "It's just the hormones talking." After Emma was born, the criticism intensified. I was too overprotective, too anxious, too focused on the baby. When I struggled with postpartum depression, the crushing exhaustion, the worry that I wasn't good enough, the tears that came without warning, Marcus turned it into evidence of my instability rather than seeking help for his struggling wife. "Sarah's always been overly emotional," I overheard him telling his mother during one of her visits. "Having a baby has just made it worse. I'm worried about her ability to make rational decisions." The gaslighting was so gradual, so consistent, that I began to believe him. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe my concerns about Emma were overblown. Maybe I was lucky to have a husband who was patient with my episodes. Emma was 2 when I first noticed how differently Marcus treated her depending on his mood. When he was happy, she was his little princess, the light of his life. But when he was stressed or angry about work, or when I'd done something to displease him, Emma became an inconvenience. Her normal toddler behavior, crying, asking questions, needing attention, would trigger explosive anger. "She's manipulating you," he'd tell me when I'd comfort her. After one of his outbursts, "You're teaching her that crying gets her whatever she wants. You're making her weak." I started walking on eggshells, trying to keep Emma quiet when Marcus was home, trying to anticipate his moods and adjust our behavior accordingly. Our house became a minefield, where the wrong word, the wrong tone, the wrong timing could set off an explosion that would last for hours. The worst part was how he'd act afterward, not apologetic but wounded, as if our emotional reactions to his anger were the real problem. "I work all day to provide for this family, and I come home to chaos," he'd say, his voice heavy with martyrdom. "All I want is some peace, but apparently that's too much to ask." When I worried about Emma crying for hours after his visits during our separation, he'd say I was projecting my anxiety. When I asked why he canceled weekend plans last minute, I was being controlled. When I cried after he forgot Emma's birthday party, too busy with a golf tournament to remember his daughter turning 4, I was too emotional for rational discussion. For 5 years I bent myself into impossible shapes, trying to be the wife he wanted. Quieter, less sensitive, more agreeable. I monitored my tone, my facial expressions, my reactions. I became a performance artist of accommodation, constantly adjusting my authentic self to fit his narrow definition of acceptable behavior. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning, when 4-year-old Emma asked me why Daddy yelled at her for spilling juice on his laptop. She'd been trying to bring him breakfast in bed as a surprise for Father's Day, carefully carrying a tray with toast, orange juice, and a drawing she'd made of our family. In her small hands, the glass had tipped, sending juice cascading across his expensive computer. "He called me clumsy, Mommy," she said, her green eyes wide with confusion. "He said I ruined his important work, and that I should think before I do things. But I was thinking about making him." When I gently brought it up to Marcus later, explaining that she'd been trying to do something nice, he exploded with a fury that shook the windows. "She needs to learn consequences. Sarah, you baby her too much. This is exactly why she's becoming spoiled and manipulative like you. Everything is always about feelings with you too. What about responsibility? What about thinking before acting? She destroyed a $1,000 laptop because you've taught her that her intentions matter more than results." His face was red, veins standing out on his forehead, spittle flying as he raged. Emma had come running at the sound of shouting, and I watched her small face crumple as her father continued his tirade. "And don't look at me like that," he snapped at her. "Crying isn't going to fix my computer or make this go away. This is what happens when you don't think." That night, I stood in Emma's doorway watching her sleep, her small fist curled around a stuffed elephant, and I realized I couldn't let her grow up thinking this was what love looked like. I couldn't let her learn that her feelings didn't matter, that walking on eggshells was normal, that she should shrink herself to make others comfortable. She was already starting to flinch when he raised his voice. She was already apologizing for things that weren't her fault. At 4 years old, my daughter was learning to manage an adult man's emotions, and I was enabling it by staying silent. I filed for divorce the next week. Marcus fought it with the fury of a man who'd lost control of his favorite toy. The custody battle stretched on for 18 months, each hearing more brutal than the last. He hired James Wellington, the kind of lawyer who smiled while shredding you apart, a man who specialized in high-conflict custody cases, and had a reputation for destroying protective mothers. Together they painted me as an unstable, vindictive ex-wife, who was weaponizing our daughter. They took every tear I'd shed, every moment of vulnerability, every instance of me advocating for Emma's emotional well-being, and twisted it into evidence of my unfitness as a mother. "Your Honor," Wellington would say in his polished courtroom voice, "Miss Mitchell has a documented history of emotional instability. She makes decisions based on feelings rather than facts, and she's systematically alienating our client from his daughter through emotional manipulation." They had witnesses, Marcus's colleagues who testified about my erratic behavior at hospital functions, his family members who spoke about my hostility toward them, his neighbors who claimed I was volatile during arguments, all carefully orchestrated, all designed to paint me as the problem. But I had something Marcus never expected. I had finally found my voice. Through 18 months of legal hell, I learned to document everything. I kept detailed records of Emma's behavior after visits, screenshots of Marcus's increasingly hostile text messages, recordings of his voicemails where he called me names and threatened to take Emma away permanently. I found Dr. Patricia Reeves, a child psychologist who specialized in divorce trauma, and started taking Emma to therapy to help her process the chaos of our family falling apart. Reeves became an unexpected ally, documenting Emma's anxiety symptoms and the clear correlation between her distress and visits with her father. Most importantly, I found my own therapist, Michelle Torres, a woman who specialized in helping survivors of emotional abuse recognize their own strength. "You're not crazy, Sarah," she told me during one particularly difficult session where I'd broken down, convinced that maybe Marcus was right about me. "You're having a normal reaction to abnormal treatment. Your emotions aren't the problem, they're the solution. They're telling you something is wrong, and you're finally listening." Week by week, session by session, I began to reclaim the woman I'd been before Marcus convinced me she was unacceptable. I remembered that I'd been a good nurse because I cared deeply about my patients. I remembered that my friends had valued my empathy and emotional intelligence. I remembered that my parents had raised me to trust my instincts and speak up for what was right. The woman who walked into the final custody hearing was not the same person who'd filed for divorce 3 years earlier. I'd found my voice, my strength, my unshakable conviction that protecting my daughter was worth any battle I'd have to fight. Emma was 7 now, with Marcus's dark hair, but my stubborn chin and my grandmother's green eyes that missed nothing. She was my everything, not in the suffocating way Marcus accused me of, but in the way that gave my life meaning and direction. She was the reason I got up every morning, the reason I'd fought through law school textbooks and nursing school clinicals, the reason I'd found the courage to finally say enough. But she was also 7 years old, which meant she was old enough to understand that her parents didn't live together anymore, that there were lawyers and judges making decisions about her life, that sometimes grown-ups said mean things about each other. She was old enough to feel caught in the middle, old enough to worry about hurting someone's feelings, old enough to start blaming herself. "Mommy, do I have to go to Daddy's this weekend?" she asked the night before our final custody hearing, her small fingers tracing patterns on my arm as we read together. It was our bedtime ritual, her choice of book, my reading until she fell asleep, then 15 minutes of quiet talk about whatever was on her mind. My heart clenched. "Why don't you want to go, sweetheart?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in her head. Emma had always been an old soul, thoughtful and observant in ways that both amazed and worried me. "He gets angry when I cry," she finally said, her voice so small and matter-of-fact that it broke my heart. "And he says you made me weak. He says strong kids don't cry about everything." I felt my chest tighten with familiar rage, not the explosive, destructive anger that Marcus wielded like a weapon, but the fierce, protective fury of a mother watching her child absorb poison and call it normal. "What do you think about that, Emma? Do you think crying makes you weak?" She considered this seriously, the way she approached all big questions. "I don't know, sometimes I feel better after I cry, like when I'm really sad or scared, but Daddy says it's baby behavior." I set down the book and looked into those wise little eyes, eyes that had seen too much, processed too much, carried too much responsibility for managing the adults in her life. "Emma, crying doesn't make you weak. Feeling things deeply makes you human. When you cry because something is sad or scary or unfair, that's your heart working exactly the way it's supposed to. Don't ever let anyone tell you your feelings don't matter." She nodded solemnly, then curled closer to me. "I wish you could come with me to Daddy's house." "I wish I could too, baby. But you know what? No matter where you are, you carry all my love with you right here." I pressed my hand to her heart. "And if anyone, makes you feel small or scared or bad about yourself, you tell them your mommy said you're perfect exactly as you are. Even if they get mad, your feelings matter, Emma. Your voice matters, you matter. Don't ever forget that." That night, after she'd fallen asleep, I sat in the kitchen staring at the custody evaluation report that had arrived that afternoon. Sandra Kim, the court-appointed evaluator, had spent 6 months interviewing Emma, observing visits with both parents, reviewing medical records and school reports. Her conclusions were devastating. While both parents love Emma, there are concerning patterns in Ms. Hoffman's interactions with the child. Emma displays heightened anxiety before and after visits with her father, and multiple observations noted his impatience with her emotional expressions. Ms. Mitchell, while emotional in her advocacy for her daughter, demonstrates consistent warmth, appropriate boundaries and responsive parenting. But I knew Marcus's lawyer would find ways to spin even this in his favor. They'd argue that Kim was biased, that Emma's anxiety was caused by my alienating behavior, that my excessive emotionality was traumatizing our daughter. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, knowing that tomorrow would determine whether I could protect her from becoming what I used to be, a woman who apologized for taking up space, who second-guessed her own instincts, who learned to make herself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. Emma stirred in her sleep, and I heard her whisper, "I love you, Mommy." Even unconscious, she was trying to take care of me, and the weight of that responsibility, her belief that I could protect her, her trust that I would fight for her, settled on my shoulders like armor. The divorce had stripped me down to nothing, then forced me to rebuild from scratch. Marcus kept the house, the 4-bedroom colonial with the white picket fence, where I'd planted roses and painted Emma's nursery in soft yellow. He kept the savings account, the investment portfolio, even my car. His lawyer was that good, and my court-appointed attorney was that overwhelmed. I moved Emma and me into a 2-bedroom apartment, above Mrs. Chen's bakery on the outskirts of town, the scent of fresh bread our morning alarm clock, and the sound of delivery trucks our evening lullaby. The apartment was small, with thin walls and windows that stuck, but it was ours. Emma helped me paint her room lavender, her small handprint still visible in the corner where she'd helped with the roller. The financial reality was brutal. Nursing had always paid well enough when Marcus's salary supplemented mine, but supporting a household on my income alone meant choosing between Emma's gymnastics classes and my own groceries, between new school clothes and fixing the car that kept breaking down. I went back to school for my nursing degree upgrade, studying for my BSN at the kitchen table after Emma went to bed, her artwork covering the walls where family photos used to hang. Some nights I fell asleep over pathophysiology textbooks, only to wake up with a blanket around my shoulders that Emma had carefully tucked around me. "You're working too hard, Mommy," she'd tell me, her 7-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of things. "But I'm proud of you for not giving up." The work was brutal, 12-hour shifts at the hospital 3 days a week, then online classes and study groups on my days off. I'd drop Emma at before-school care at 6 a.m., work until 7 p.m., pick her up from after-school care, help with homework, make dinner, and then settle in for 4 hours of studying while she slept. My body was exhausted, my brain was fried, but I kept going because I could see the finish line. A BSN meant better job opportunities, more money, more stability. It meant being able to provide for Emma without constantly worrying about making rent. Marcus used my schedule against me at every opportunity. He'd show up unannounced during my study time, claiming he was worried about Emma's well-being. "Sarah looks tired," he'd tell his lawyer. "I'm concerned. She's not capable of maintaining appropriate supervision." He'd schedule emergencies during my shifts, claiming Emma was sick or needed something urgently, then use my absence as evidence that I was unreliable. The most difficult part was watching Emma navigate the confusion of our new reality. She'd come home from Marcus's weekends quieter than usual, carrying the weight of whatever manipulative conversations had happened during their time together. "Daddy says you're stressed because you have to work so much now," she told me one Sunday night, her small face serious as she helped me fold laundry. "He says if you weren't so stubborn you could come back home and be a family again." I stopped folding, my hand stilling on one of her school uniforms. "What do you think about that, sweetheart?" "I think Daddy doesn't understand that sometimes families look different than what he wants them to look like," she said with the clarity that constantly amazed me. "And I think our apartment smells better than our old house because Mrs. Chen makes cinnamon rolls on Sundays." These moments, Emma's resilience, her ability to find joy in small things, her fierce loyalty, kept me going through the darkest night. When I'd come home from a particularly brutal shift, to find an eviction notice, when my car broke down in the hospital parking lot, when Marcus's lawyer filed another motion questioning my fitness, Emma would wrap her small arms around me and remind me why I was fighting. "We're a good team, aren't we, Mommy?" she'd say, and I'd remember that we were building something together, not just a new life but a new definition of family based on love instead of control. The breakthrough came during my pediatric nursing rotation. I was working with Dr. Amanda Foster, a pediatrician who specialized in trauma-informed care,
And something about the way she talked about children's emotional development resonated deeply. The kids who recover best from difficult situations aren't the ones who don't feel deeply, she told me during one of our shifts. They're the ones who have at least one adult who validates their feelings and teaches them that emotions are information, not weakness. That night, I started a journal, not just for therapeutic purposes, but as document. I wrote down every conversation Emma and I had about her visits with Marcus, every anxiety symptom she displayed, every breakthrough moment when she processed her feelings in healthy ways. I also started attending a support group for single mothers at the community center. The group was led by Dr. Rosa Martinez, a licensed clinical social worker, who'd been through her own custody battle years earlier. The system is designed to punish women for having emotions, she told us during one particularly powerful session. Society tells us that good mothers are selfless and accommodating, but then uses our advocacy for our children as evidence that we're unstable. We have to learn to own our strength without apologizing for it. Week after week, I sat in that circle with other women who'd been called too emotional, vindictive, unstable for trying to protect their children from harmful situations. We shared strategies, offered encouragement, and reminded each other that loving our children fiercely wasn't a character flaw, it was our greatest strength. I graduated summa cum laude from my BSN program on a warm May afternoon. Emma sat in the front row at my commencement, wearing a dress she'd picked out herself and holding a sign that said "That's my mommy" in glittery letters. When they called my name, she cheered so loudly that other families turned to smile at us, and I felt something shift in my chest, pride, not just in my accomplishment, but in the woman I'd become. That night, she made me a card with construction paper and marker. On the front, she'd drawn two stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. Inside, in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, she'd written, "Dear Mommy, I'm proud of you, you're the strongest person I know, thank you for taking care of us, love Emma." I kept that card in my purse every day, armor against Marcus's attempts to convince me I was falling apart. It was proof that what I was building with Emma, this relationship based on mutual respect, emotional honesty and unconditional love, was worth every battle I'd had to fight. The new job came 2 weeks after graduation, a position in the pediatric ICU at Children's Hospital, with a significant pay increase and benefits that would finally give us real security. Emma helped me celebrate by picking out a new apartment in a better school district, a place with 2 full bedrooms, and a kitchen window that looked out onto a playground. "This feels like home," she said as we painted her new room, and I realized she was right. For the first time since leaving Marcus, I felt like we weren't just surviving, we were thriving, but I knew Marcus wasn't done with us. The custody modification hearing was still looming, and his determination to regain control hadn't diminished. If anything, my success seemed to fuel his anger. His text messages became increasingly hostile, his accusations more desperate. "You think you're so much better now with your fancy degree and your new job," he wrote after hearing about my promotion. "But I know who you really are, Sarah. The judge will see it too." I screenshotted every message, added it to my growing file of documentation, and reminded myself that his opinion of me no longer mattered. What mattered was Emma, and the life we were building together, and the strength I'd found in finally refusing to make myself smaller for anyone else's comfort. The courthouse hadn't changed in the 3 years since our divorce was finalized. Same beige walls that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who looked at them too long. Same uncomfortable wooden benches that made you shift constantly. Same smell of anxiety and industrial cleaning supplies that hit you the moment you walked through the metal detector. But I wasn't the same woman who'd walked these halls with shaking hands and a voice that barely rose above a whisper. The woman entering Judge Harrison's courtroom that morning wore a navy blue suit that fit properly, carried herself with straight shoulders, and had spent 3 years learning the difference between emotional stability and emotional suppression. I'd been dreading this return for months, not because I wasn't prepared. My lawyer Rebecca Santos was thorough and competent, even if she wasn't as expensive as Marcus's legal team. Not because I doubted my case. The evidence was overwhelming that Emma thrived in my care and regressed after visits with her father. I was dreading it because courtrooms were Marcus's territory. This was where he'd spent 3 years systematically dismantling my character, where his lawyer had twisted every maternal instinct into evidence of instability, where I'd been forced to defend my love for my daughter as if it were a crime. Marcus's family filled the benches behind him like a wall of disapproval. His mother, Patricia Hoffman, caught my eye and shook her head with the practiced disappointment of a woman who'd never forgiven me for not being grateful enough for her son's attention. She'd spent our entire marriage making little comments about my parenting, my housekeeping, my career choices, always with that sweet smile that made me question whether I was imagining the criticism. His sister Jennifer sat beside her with the same pinched expression she'd worn to every family gathering, the one that said she couldn't understand why Marcus had settled for someone so ordinary. His father, Richard Hoffman, looked distinguished and somber, the respected physician who'd raised Marcus to believe that his emotional needs always came first. Behind them sat a collection of Marcus's colleagues and friends, all there to testify about what a wonderful father he was, how concerned they were about Emma's well-being in my care, how they'd witnessed my erratic behavior at various social functions over the years. Marcus himself looked exactly as he always had, confident, impeccably dressed, the kind of man who commanded rooms without trying. He'd gained weight around his middle, stress eating maybe, or just the natural progression of a man in his late 30s who'd always been more focused on appearances than actual health. But his smile was still sharp enough to cut glass when he turned it on Judge Harrison, still charming enough to make people want to please him. "Sarah," he nodded as I took my seat at the opposite table, my lawyer shuffling through papers beside me. His voice carried that tone I remembered so well, polite on the surface, but with an undercurrent of condescension that made my skin crawl. I didn't respond. I'd learned that silence was often the strongest response to his attempts at manipulation. Dr. Torres had taught me that in our sessions. "You don't owe him your emotional energy, Sarah. Not anymore." Emma sat in the gallery behind me, her small hand clasped in my mother's. She'd insisted on coming despite my attempts to spare her from this. "I want to tell the judge that I want to live with you, Mommy," she'd said with 7-year-old logic. "He should know. My parents had driven 3 hours to be here. They'd been furious when they learned about the custody modification, not at me but at Marcus for putting Emma through another round of legal proceedings when she was finally starting to feel secure. 'That man has some nerve,' my father had said when I told them about the hearing. 'After everything he's put you both through, he wants to drag you back to court. What's his endgame here?' The endgame was control. It had always been about control. Marcus couldn't accept that I'd built a successful life without him, that Emma was happy and thriving in our small apartment, that we'd proven we didn't need him to be whole. The weight of Emma's trust settled on my shoulders like a prayer, as I watched her whisper something to my mother, then give me a small wave and an encouraging smile. She was wearing the dress she'd picked out for my nursing school graduation, navy blue with small white flowers, her lucky dress she called it. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd seen every possible variation of family conflict. She was in her 60s now, with silver hair and no patience for games. She'd presided over our original divorce, and I could see recognition flicker in her eyes as she reviewed the case file. I remembered her from 3 years ago, how she'd tried to ask gentle questions about the bruising on my arms from Marcus's grip during one of our arguments, how she'd looked skeptical when his lawyer painted me as vindictive and unstable. She'd awarded joint custody then despite the evidence because the system was designed to preserve fathers' rights even when those rights came at the expense of children's well-being. But things had changed since then. Emma was older, able to express her preferences more clearly. I had documentation now, evidence, professional support. Most importantly, I had found my voice.
This hearing is to address Mr. Hoffman's petition for primary custody of the minor child, Emma Hoffman, Judge Harrison announced, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "Mr. Hoffman, I understand you're seeking this modification based on concerns about the current custody arrangement. Please present your opening statement." Marcus's lawyer, James Wellington, stood with theatrical precision. He was a man in his 50s with perfectly styled gray hair and a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He specialized in high-conflict custody cases and had a reputation for destroying protective mothers with surgical precision. "Your Honor, we're here today because my client is deeply concerned about his daughter's well-being in her mother's care," Wellington began, his voice carrying that practiced tone of righteous concern. "Over the past 3 years, we've documented numerous instances of Mitchell's inability to provide stable, emotionally appropriate care for Emma." The familiar knot formed in my stomach as he began laying out their case. Every moment of vulnerability I'd shown during our marriage, every tear I'd shed during the divorce proceedings, every instance of me advocating for Emma's emotional needs, all of it was about to be weaponized against me once again. But this time I was ready. This time I had something Marcus had never expected me to find. The unshakable conviction that protecting my daughter was worth any battle I'd have to fight. Your Honor, we have documented instances of Mitchell's erratic behavior, her inability to maintain stable employment during the marriage, and witness testimony regarding her volatile emotional responses to normal parenting disagreements. Wellington continued, his voice gaining momentum as he built his case. He began laying out photos, transcripts, character statements, all carefully curated to paint me as the hysterical ex-wife. A photo of me crying outside the courthouse after our divorce hearing. Screenshots of text messages where I'd expressed frustration about Marcus's parenting decision. A statement from his neighbor claiming she'd heard me yelling during a custody exchange. Each piece of evidence felt like a physical blow, designed to strip away the confidence I'd spent 3 years rebuilding. But I forced myself to stay present, to remember Torres's words. They're going to try to make you feel small again, Sarah. Don't let them. Your emotions aren't the problem. Their inability to handle them is. Marcus took the stand with the confidence of a man who'd been preparing for this moment for years. He looked directly at Judge Harrison as he spoke, his voice measured and concerned. Your Honor, I love my daughter more than anything in this world, he began, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from scoffing. But I'm deeply worried about the environment she's living in. Sarah has always been emotionally volatile. During our marriage, I tried to be patient with her mood swings, her tendency to overreact to minor disagreements. But now that Emma is being exposed to this instability on a daily basis, I can't stay silent. He went on to describe me as manipulative, unstable, vindictive. He claimed that Emma came home from visits with me anxious and hostile toward him, that I was engaging in parental alienation by encouraging her negative feelings about their relationship. She uses our daughter as a weapon against me. Your Honor, he said, his voice heavy with practiced pain. Emma comes home from visits with her mother filled with anxiety and hostility toward me. She's been taught to fear me, to see me as the enemy. I believe Ms. Mitchell is engaging in systematic parental alienation. The words were like physical blows. I felt my chest tighten, my breathing shallow. This was it. The moment Marcus had orchestrated for 3 years. The final humiliation. His witnesses came next. A parade of character assassination disguised as concern. Patricia Hoffman took the stand and described me as always difficult, even during the good times, and claimed that Emma had confided in her about being scared when I got upset. Marcus's colleague, Stephen Walsh, testified about my inappropriate behavior at a hospital Christmas party 3 years ago. When I'd confronted Marcus about flirting with a resident, she made a scene, he said solemnly. It was clear she had emotional regulation issues. Jennifer Hoffman described my hostile attitude toward Marcus's family, my refusal to accept feedback about my parenting, my obvious manipulation of Emma's emotion. One by one, they painted a picture of a woman who was too emotional, too unstable, too vindictive to be trusted with primary custody of a 7-year-old child. I watched 3 years of my growth, my healing, my hard-fought stability get systematically dismantled by people who'd never seen me parent, never witnessed the quiet moments of connection between Emma and me, never understood that my emotions weren't weakness, they were strength. Then Judge Harrison looked up from the papers Wellington had submitted. Mr. Wellington, I notice in your client's motion you reference security footage from Mr. Hoffman's apartment building. Where is this footage? Marcus and his lawyer exchanged glances. Wellington's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment. Your Honor, we felt the testimonial evidence was sufficient to demonstrate. I asked for the security footage, Miss Wellington, Judge Harrison, interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been doing this job for 20 years. If you're using it as grounds for your custody request, I want to see it. If it supports your client's claims about Mitchell's behavior, surely you'd want me to review it. The silence stretched like a held breath. Wellington cleared his throat and shuffled through his papers. We'll need a few minutes to retrieve it from our files, Your Honor. But I saw something flicker across Marcus's face, the same expression he used to get when I'd asked to see the credit card statements he claimed showed my frivolous spending. The same look he'd worn when I'd asked for documentation of the complaints he said my supervisors had made about my work performance. It was the look of a man who'd been caught in a lie he'd told so many times he'd almost started believing it himself. Take the time you need, Judge Harrison said coolly. But I want to see that footage before we proceed. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Marcus's legal team huddled in urgent whispers while the courtroom waited in tense silence. I could see the doubt creeping into the faces of his witnesses. The slow realization that maybe their testimony hadn't been as airtight as they'd thought. Emma squeezed my mother's hand and whispered something that made my mom nod encouragingly. My daughter's presence behind me felt like a lighthouse in a storm, steady, bright, reminding me what I was fighting for. Finally, Wellington returned to his position with visible reluctance. Your Honor, we've located the footage. However, I should note that the incident in question, emotionally charged for both parties involved. I'm sure it was, Judge Harrison replied dryly. Please proceed. 20 minutes later, the bailiff wheeled in an old TV and VCR setup. Marcus's lawyer inserted a tape with the careful movements of a man handling evidence he'd rather not show. The confidence that had carried him through the first part of the hearing had evaporated, replaced by the stiff posture of someone going through motions he knew would end badly. This footage is from the security camera in Mr. Hoffman's apartment building hallway taken during a custody exchange 3 months ago, Wellington said, his earlier authority notably diminished. The incident occurred on March 15 at approximately 6 p.m. The grainy black and white footage began to play. I watched myself walking down the hallway, Emma's small hand in mine, her overnight bag slung over my shoulder. We looked normal, peaceful even. A mother and daughter heading to what should have been a routine visit with her father. The timestamp showed. We stopped at Marcus's door, apartment 4B. Emma was chattering about something, gesturing with her free hand in the animated way she had when she was excited about sharing news. The courtroom was silent except for the whisper of the old tape. On screen, Emma knocked on her father's door with the special rhythm they'd developed. 3 quick knocks, pause, 2 more. It was supposed to be their thing, their little ritual that made her feel special. The door opened, and I could see Marcus's figure in the doorway, though the angle made it hard to see details clearly. Emma stepped forward with her arms out, clearly expecting the hug that should have been automatic when a child sees her parent after a week apart. But Marcus stepped back, not just a casual step, but a deliberate visible withdrawal from his daughter's embrace. Even on the grainy footage, you could see Emma's arms drop to her sides, her small body language shifting from excitement to confusion. Then Emma stepped forward again, this time more hesitant, and I watched Marcus's mouth move as he said something that made her shoulders curl inward. Whatever he'd said, it wasn't kind, and it wasn't appropriate for a 7-year-old who'd been looking forward to seeing her father all week. The camera caught Emma turning back toward me, her small face crumpled in confusion. I knelt down to her level, clearly comforting her, smoothing her hair back from her face in the gesture I'd done 1,000 times before. My body language was gentle, protective, a mother trying to repair damage she hadn't caused. That's when Marcus stepped fully into the hallway. Even without sound, his body language was unmistakable. Aggressive posture, finger pointing, shoulders squared for confrontation. He was clearly yelling, though the footage couldn't capture his words. But I remembered them perfectly. Don't coddle her, Sarah. She needs to learn that the world doesn't revolve around her feelings. Stop making her weak. I watched my past self stand slowly, putting myself between Marcus and Emma. My posture was calm, my hands open in a peacekeeping gesture. I could see myself speaking, probably trying to de-escalate the situation, likely asking him to lower his voice because Emma was getting upset. But Marcus stepped closer, invading my space, his face twisted with anger. The camera angle captured him leaning over me, using his height and bulk to intimidate, the way he used to do in our kitchen when he wanted to end an argument through sheer physical presence. Then Emma did something that made my heart stop all over again. She tugged on my jacket and said something that made me look down. Even on the grainy footage, you could see the tears on her small face, the way she pressed herself against my legs seeking comfort and protection. That's when I lost it. Not the screaming, violent breakdown Marcus had described to anyone who would listen. On the footage, you could see me speaking firmly, my hands gesturing to Emma, then to Marcus, protective, not aggressive. A mother defending her child from emotional abuse. I remembered exactly what I'd said. She's 7 years old. Marcus, she missed you and wanted a hug. The appropriate response is to hug your daughter, not lecture her about being too emotional. But Marcus had stepped even closer, clearly still yelling. The camera caught the moment I'd had enough. I moved forward, not backing down,
my voice clearly raised now. But even in my anger, my body language remained protective, rather than aggressive. I was shielding Emma, not attacking Marcus. Judge Harrison paused the tape. Mr. Hoffman, would you like to explain what we're seeing here? The silence stretched. Marcus's face had gone pale, his confident courtroom demeanor cracking like old paint. Your Honor, you can see how she became confrontational when I tried to teach Emma. I see a father refusing to hug his daughter, then verbally attacking the mother when she comforts the child. Judge Harrison said coolly, would you like me to continue the footage? She didn't wait for an answer. The tape resumed, showing Marcus grabbing Emma's arm roughly when she tried to move toward me for comfort. Emma was clearly crying now, her small body shaking with sobs that seemed to bounce off the hallway wall. The footage showed me immediately intervening, gently removing Marcus's hand from Emma's arm, and picking her up, her small arms wrapped around my neck while Marcus continued his tirade, his mouth moving angrily as he gestured between Emma and me. Then came the moment that changed everything. Emma turned in my arms, and said something to her father. Even without sound, you could see Marcus's entire demeanor shift. He stepped back as if he'd been slapped, his face cycling through shock, anger, and something that might have been shame. The last frame showed me walking away with Emma, her face buried in my shoulder, while Marcus stood alone in his doorway watching us leave. Judge Harrison turned off the TV and looked directly at Marcus. What did your daughter say to you in that moment, Mr. Hoff? Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. The courtroom waited in heavy silence. His lawyer whispered something urgent in his ear, but Marcus shook his head. She told him to stop being mean to me, I said quietly, my voice carrying in the silence. She asked him why he always made me cry. The words landed in the courtroom like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread to every corner of the room. I could hear someone in the gallery draw in a sharp breath, probably my mother, who'd never heard the full story of what Emma had witnessed during those custody exchanges. Is that accurate, Mr. Hoffman? Judge Harrison asked. Marcus looked like a man watching his house burn down. His carefully constructed narrative was crumbling in real time, destroyed by his own evidence. Your Honor, that was the stress of the custody situation. The stress? Judge Harrison's voice could have frozen water. Mr. Hoffman, this footage shows you rejecting your daughter's affection, berating her mother in front of her, and physically grabbing a 7-year-old child hard enough to make her cry. You then submitted a motion claiming the mother was too emotional. Wellington was frantically shuffling through papers, looking for some way to salvage his case. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that he made mistakes in that particular incident. But mistakes? Judge Harrison interrupted. Mr. Wellington, your client testified under oath that Miss Mitchell was emotionally unstable and unfit for custody. This footage shows the exact opposite. It shows a mother protecting her child from inappropriate behavior. My lawyer, Rebecca Santos, finally spoke up. She'd been quietly taking notes throughout the hearing, and I could see the controlled excitement in her posture as she realized how dramatically the case had shifted. Your Honor, we have additional evidence we'd like to submit. Text messages from Hoffman to my client, and testimony from Emma's school counselor regarding behavioral changes after visits with her father. I'll hear it, Judge Harrison said. The next hour was devastating for Marcus's case. Rebecca presented the text messages, systematically, reading them aloud in her clear professional voice. You're pathetic, Sarah. Emma will figure out what kind of person you really are eventually. Stop filling our daughter's head with lies about me. You're turning her into a victim just like you. I should have fought harder for full custody from the beginning. You're not stable enough to raise a goldfish, let alone a child. Emma asked to call you during her visit today. I told her you were probably too busy with your own drama to talk to her. Each message was more damning than the last, painting a picture of a man who used his daughter as a weapon against his ex-wife, who deliberately undermined Emma's sense of security, who punished her for loving her mother. Then Rebecca called Emma's school counselor, Mrs. Patricia Webb, to the stand. Mrs. Webb was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s, who'd worked with children for over 20 years. Her testimony was calm, factual, and devastating. Emma displays a clear pattern of anxiety that correlates directly with her father's visitation schedule, Mrs. Webb explained. She's fine Monday through Wednesday, but Thursday afternoons, she becomes withdrawn and anxious about the upcoming weekend visit. Monday mornings after visits with her father, she often asks to call her mother and sometimes becomes tearful during class. Have you observed any similar patterns related to her time with her mother? Rebecca asked. No, Emma speaks positively about her time with Miss Mitchell. She describes their activities together, mentions feeling safe and happy at home. When she talks about her mother, her body language is relaxed and animated. When she talks about her father, she becomes tense and speaks more quietly. In your professional opinion, Miss Webb, what does this suggest about Emma's emotional well-being in each environment? It suggests that one environment feels safe and nurturing to her, while the other feels stressful and unpredictable. Wellington tried to salvage something during cross-examination, suggesting that Emma's anxiety was caused by parental alienation on my part. But Mrs. Webb shut that down quickly. I've seen cases of parental alienation, Mr. Wellington. This isn't that. Children who are being alienated against a parent typically express anger or hostility toward that parent. Emma doesn't express anger toward her father, she expresses fear and sadness. She wants his approval and love, but she's afraid of disappointing him. Then my mother took the stand. Dorothy Mitchell was 62 years old, a retired elementary school principal, who'd raised 4 children and helped raise countless grandchildren. She had the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of understanding child behavior, and she used every bit of it as she testified. I've watched my daughter rebuild herself from nothing, she said, her voice steady and clear. I've seen her work 3 jobs while going to nursing school, never missing a single one of Emma's school events. I've watched her comfort that little girl after visits where she comes home quiet and withdrawn, helping her process emotions that no 7-year-old should have to carry. She turned to look directly at Marcus, her expression stern but not unkind. I've also watched Emma flinch when she hears raised voices, seen her apologize for things that aren't her fault, watched her try to manage her father's emotions in ways that break my heart. If wanting to protect your child from emotional manipulation makes you too emotional, then I raised my daughter right. The shift in the room was palpable. Even some of Marcus's family members were looking uncomfortable. His aunt Margaret, who'd always been kind to me during our marriage, was openly crying. I could see her whispering urgently to Patricia Hoffman, who was staring at her hands and refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Marcus's colleague, Dr. Walsh, who testified earlier about my inappropriate behavior, was studying the floor with sudden intense interest. The narrative he'd supported was crumbling in real time, and he was smart enough to recognize the implications. Wellington made a desperate attempt at damage control. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that he's made mistakes, but he loves his daughter deeply. He's been under tremendous stress due to the contentious nature of this custody battle. Love isn't a feeling, counselor, Judge Harrison interrupted. It's a behavior, and the behavior I've seen demonstrated here today shows a clear pattern of emotional manipulation and intimidation. She looked directly at Emma, who was still holding my mother's hand in the gallery. Young lady, would you like to tell me how you feel about where you'd like to live? Emma stood up with the solemn dignity of a child who'd been forced to grow up too fast. Her small voice carried clearly through the courtroom. I want to live with my mommy, she said simply. She doesn't yell at me when I'm sad. She says my feelings are important, and she helps me understand them instead of telling me they're wrong. She paused, looking directly at Marcus with the kind of brutal honesty that only children possess. Daddy gets angry when I cry, and he says mommy made me weak. But I don't think I'm weak. I think I'm brave for telling the truth even when it makes people uncomfortable. The silence was deafening. Emma sat back down, reaching for my mother's hand again, and the weight of her words settled over the courtroom like snow. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. Thank you, Emma. You are indeed very brave. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations and shifting bodies, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Marcus's family, who'd sat in solidarity behind him for 3 years of legal proceedings, were now fragmenting in real time. His Aunt Margaret was crying openly, her hand pressed to her mouth, as if trying to hold back words she could no longer contain. She kept looking between Marcus and Emma, and I could see the moment when years of willful blindness cracked open to reveal the truth she'd been avoiding. Patricia Hoffman, Marcus's mother, sat rigid in her seat, her face cycling through emotions too complex to name. She'd spent 3 years telling anyone who would listen about my instability, about how Marcus was the victim of a vindictive ex-wife, about how Emma needed her father's stability. Now she was faced with security footage that showed her son emotionally abusing both his daughter and his ex-wife, and the cognitive dissonance was written across her features. Judge Harrison banged her gavel to restore order, but the damage was done. The careful narrative Marcus and his lawyer had constructed over months of preparation had collapsed in the space of an hour, destroyed by his own evidence and his daughter's simple, devastating honesty. "Miss Hoffman," Judge Harrison said, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years on the family court bench, "do you have anything to add to explain this footage, or your daughter's testimony?" Marcus looked like a man watching his world implode. His confident courtroom demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate flailing of someone who'd built his entire case on lies and manipulation. "Your Honor, I was having a difficult day. The stress of the custody situation has been overwhelming, and I know I haven't always handled it perfectly." The stress, Judge Harrison's voice could have cut glass. "Miss Hoffman, this footage shows you rejecting your daughter's affection, berating her mother in front of her, and physically grabbing a 7-year-old child hard enough to make her cry. You then submitted a motion claiming the mother was too emotional and unfit for custody. How do you reconcile this contradiction?" Wellington was frantically shuffling through papers, looking for some angle, some precedent, some way to salvage a case that had imploded spectacularly. "Your Honor, my client has been under enormous pressure. He's concerned about his daughter's well-being, and perhaps his approach hasn't always been perfect, but his intentions are irrelevant when we're talking about a child's safety and emotional well-being." Judge Harrison cut him off. "What matters is behavior, and the behavior documented in this courtroom today is deeply concerning." She turned her attention back to Marcus. "Miss Hoffman, your daughter just testified that you tell her she's weak for having emotions, that you get angry when she cries, that you've told her mother made her weak. Is this accurate?" Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. The courtroom waited. His face was flushed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Your Honor, I've tried to teach Emma to be strong, to not let emotions overwhelm rational thinking. She's 7 years old," Judge Harrison said, her voice incredulous. 7-year-old children are supposed to have emotions. They're supposed to cry when they're hurt or scared or sad. That's normal child development, not a character flaw to be corrected." The shift in the gallery was palpable. I could hear whispered conversations breaking out behind Marcus as his supporters began to process what they were hearing. His colleague, Walsh, was looking increasingly uncomfortable, probably realizing that his testimony about my emotional instability now looked like complicity in emotional abuse. Even Marcus's sister Jennifer, who testified earlier about my hostile attitude toward their family, was staring at her brother with dawning horror. She had 2 young children of her own, and I could see her mentally reviewing every interaction she'd witnessed between Marcus and Emma through this new lens. Rebecca stood to address the court. "Your Honor, based on the evidence presented today, we're requesting that the court not only deny Ms. Hoffman's petition for primary custody, but also modify the existing custody arrangement to better protect Emma's emotional well-being." "What are you proposing?" Judge Harrison asked. "Supervised visitation for Ms. Hoffman pending completion of anger management and parenting classes, with a requirement for individual therapy to address his inappropriate responses to his daughter's emotional expressions," Rebecca said clearly. "We're also requesting that Emma be allowed to continue her sessions with Dr. Patricia Reeves, who has been helping her process the trauma of this ongoing custody battle." Wellington shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is punitive and excessive. My client made mistakes in one isolated incident," Rebecca interrupted, pulling out a thick fold. "Your Honor, we have documentation of dozens of similar incidents. Text messages where Mr. Hoffman berates his daughter for missing her mother. School reports showing Emma's anxiety spikes correlating with his visitation schedule. Testimony from multiple witnesses about his pattern of emotional manipulation." She began reading from the school reports, Marcus's own text messages, documentation I'd kept meticulously over 3 years of trying to protect my daughter from psychological damage. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of Marcus's case. But more than that, it was vindication for every time I'd been told I was overreacting, every time I'd been dismissed as too emotional, every time I'd been made to question my own instincts about what was best for my child. The courtroom fell silent as Rebecca finished presenting the evidence. Judge Harrison reviewed the documents, her expression growing more grave with each page. "Mr. Wellington, does your client have any response to this documentation?" Wellington whispered urgently with Marcus, but I could see from their body language that they had nothing. Marcus had spent 3 years painting me as unstable and vindictive, never imagining that his own behavior would be so thoroughly documented and exposed. "Your Honor," Wellington said finally, My client requests time to review these allegations and prepare a response. Ms. Wellington, your client had months to prepare for this hearing. He chose to build his case on claims that have been thoroughly refuted by his own evidence. Judge Harrison's voice was flat, professional, final. I'm ready to make my ruling. The courtroom fell silent. Emma squeezed my mother's hand and looked at me with those green eyes that had seen too much but somehow still sparkled with hope. I gave her a small smile and mouthed, I love you, feeling my heart swell with pride at her courage.
Judge Harrison's ruling was swift and decisive. Primary custody to me, with Marcus granted supervised visitation every other weekend, pending completion of anger management classes, parenting education and individual therapy. The gavel came down like the period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, Mr. Hoffman will be responsible for the costs of Emma's continued therapy with Dr. Reeves, as well as family therapy sessions to help repair the damage done to his relationship with his daughter. Any violation of these terms will result in immediate suspension of visitation rights. As we walked out of the courthouse, Emma slipped her hand into mine, her small fingers warm and steady. Mommy, are you crying because you're happy or sad? Happy tears, baby. Definitely happy tears. The courthouse steps were bathed in late afternoon sunlight, and for the first time in 3 years I felt like I could breathe fully. We'd won, but more than that, we'd survived. Emma and I had weathered Marcus's attempts to break us down, to convince us that our love for each other was pathological, that my protective instincts were hysteria. My parents flanked us as we walked to the car, my mother's arm around Emma's shoulders, my father carrying the bag of legal documents that had become our freedom papers. I'm proud of you, sweetheart, my mother said quietly. Both of you, you fought for what was right, and you never gave up. The news somehow made it to social media within hours. Dr. Walsh's wife, apparently, had a friend who'd been in the gallery, and she shared the story in a private Facebook group for medical families. From there it spread like wildfire. Judge plays security footage that backfires spectacularly on abusive father, read one headline. Father claims ex-wife is too emotional, then his own evidence proves her right, read another. Within days, the story had spread across platforms. My phone buzzed constantly with friend requests, interview requests, and messages from strangers. The story resonated with thousands of people who'd been dismissed as too emotional for protecting their children, who'd been gaslit and manipulated by partners who used their natural parental instincts against them. I received messages from women all over the country sharing their own story. A mother in Texas who'd been told she was hysterical for wanting to limit her ex-husband's drinking during custody visits. A father in Oregon labeled vindictive for documenting his ex-wife's neglect of their autistic son. A grandmother in Florida who'd been dismissed as interfering for reporting her daughter-in-law's drug use. Parent after parent who'd been told that their protective instincts were actually manipulation, that their emotional responses to their children's distress were evidence of instability, that fighting for their kids' well-being made them unfit. The story was picked up by parenting blogs, then mainstream media. Suddenly I was being invited to appear on morning shows, to write op-eds about emotional abuse and custody battles, to speak at conferences about the importance of believing protective parents. You've become a symbol, Rebecca told me after a particularly intense week of media attention. People see your story and recognize their own struggles. You're giving voice to parents who've been silenced by a system that confuses emotional manipulation with legitimate concern. It wasn't the fame I'd ever wanted, but it was a platform I was grateful to have. Emma and I decided together how much exposure we were comfortable with. She was proud of our victory but still just a 7-year-old who wanted to focus on second grade and learning to ride her bike without training wheels. The first supervised visit between Emma and Marcus took place 3 weeks after the hearing, at a family visitation center down. I waited in the parking lot, my stomach in knots, while Emma spent 2 hours with her father under the watchful eye of a trained supervisor. She came out quiet but not broken, processing but not destroyed. He said he was sorry, she told me on the drive home. He said he's going to learn how to be a better daddy. I told him I hope he does, because I love him but I don't like how he acts sometimes. The wisdom of children. Emma could hold both truths simultaneously, that she loved her father and that his behavior had hurt her. She didn't need him to be a villain to justify protecting herself from his dysfunction. Dr. Reeves helped us navigate this new phase. these carefully supervised interactions where Marcus was forced to confront the impact of his behavior on his daughter. Some visits went well, others ended early when Marcus reverted to his old patterns of criticizing Emma's emotional responses. But Emma was stronger now, more confident in her own worth. When Marcus told her she was being dramatic for crying about a scraped knee, she looked him in the eye and said, "My mommy says crying is how we take care of our hurt feelings. Why don't you want me to take care of my feelings?" The supervisor noted that exchange in her report, along with Marcus's uncomfortable silence in response. 6 months later, Emma and I were having our usual Sunday morning pancake breakfast in our new apartment, a bright, airy place with big windows and a kitchen island where she could do homework while I cooked. She was chattering about her upcoming school play, her words tumbling over each other in excitement, and Mrs. Peterson said I could be the narrator because I have a strong voice, and I told her that you taught me that having a strong voice is important. She said she could tell I had a good mommy, because I'm not afraid to speak up when something isn't right, and Tommy Martinez said his dad told him that speaking up too much makes you a troublemaker. But I told him that's not true because she stopped mid-sentence and looked at me seriously. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Mommy, what does too emotional mean?" My heart skipped. I set down my coffee cup and really looked at her. This beautiful, sensitive, strong little girl who felt everything deeply and wasn't afraid to show. Her hair was in pigtails, syrup on her chin, and those green eyes that had seen too much but somehow still sparkled with joy and curiosity. "Where did you hear that phrase, sweetheart?" "I heard Daddy say it on the phone to Grandma Hoffman when I was at the visitation center last week. He said you were too emotional and that's why the judge was wrong to believe you instead of him." I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. This conversation had been coming for months, and I'd rehearsed various versions in my head, but now that it was here I wanted to get it exactly right. "Emma, some people think that caring deeply about things makes you weak. They think that crying or getting upset when something is wrong means you can't handle life properly. They think that feeling things strongly is a problem that needs to be fixed." She considered this, chewing thoughtfully on her pancake. "But you know what I think?" "What do you think, babe?" "I think feeling things deeply means you have a big heart. I think getting upset when something is unfair means you know right from wrong. And I think standing up for people you love, even when it's scary, makes you the strongest kind of person there is." The words hit me like a physical force. This 7-year-old child, who'd been told by her father that emotions were weakness, who'd witnessed courtroom battles and custody evaluations and adult dysfunction, had distilled everything down to this perfect, simple truth. "So being emotional is actually being brave," she continued, her voice gaining confidence. "The bravest," I confirmed, reaching over to tuck a curl behind her ear. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that your feelings make you weak, okay? They make you human. They make you real. They make you exactly who you're supposed to be." Emma grinned and went back to her pancakes, but I stayed still for a moment, watching her. This little girl who'd witnessed too much, who'd been caught in the middle of adult problems she shouldn't have had to navigate, who'd stood up in a courtroom and asked for what she needed. She was going to be okay. More than okay. She was going to be the kind of woman who never apologized for taking up space, who never let anyone convince her that her voice didn't matter, who knew the difference between love and control. She was going to be the kind of person who could feel deeply without drowning, who could be strong without being hard, who could protect herself without closing her heart. She was going to be everything I'd forgotten I could be, until she taught me how to remember. "Mom," Emma looked up from arranging berries on her pancakes in a perfect smiley face pattern. "Are you proud of us?" "So proud," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" "The best team," she agreed, then added with the casual wisdom of childhood. "We should probably invite Daddy to be on our team someday, when he learns how to be nice to feeling." As I watched Emma carefully construct her berry smiley face, humming to herself in that unconscious way children do when they're completely content, I realized that Marcus had been wrong about so many things, but he'd been especially wrong about this. My emotions hadn't made me weak, they'd made me fight, they'd made me leave, they'd made me rebuild, they'd made me strong enough to protect the most important thing in my world. In the end, being too emotional had saved us both. Outside, spring rain tapped gently against our kitchen window, washing the world clean. Emma looked up at me with syrup on her chin, and joy in her eyes, and said the words that would stay with me forever. "I love you, Mommy, your feelings and everything. I love you too, baby girl, your feelings and everything. And in that moment, in our bright apartment with the big windows and the berry smiley faces, with the scent of pancakes and coffee filling the air and my daughter's laughter echoing off the walls, I knew we were exactly where we belonged. The judge had played the security footage, and the truth had set us free, but more than that, we'd learned to set ourselves free from the voices that told us we were too much, too sensitive, too emotional to trust our own heart. We'd learned that sometimes being too emotional just means you're brave enough to feel everything, strong enough to stand up for what's right, and wise enough to know that love without respect isn't love at all. We were just exactly emotional enough. A year later, Marcus completed his court-ordered therapy and parenting classes. His supervised visits with Emma gradually transitioned to unsupervised time as he learned to respond to her emotions with patience instead of criticism. He would never be the father she deserved, but he was learning to be the father she needed, one who could sit with her feelings without trying to fix or minimize them. The story of our custody battle continued to resonate online, shared by thousands of parents who'd found strength in our victory. I used the platform to advocate for family court reform, to push for better training for judges and lawyers handling custody cases involving emotional abuse. Emma thrived in ways that still took my breath away. She was confident, articulate, emotionally intelligent, everything I'd dreamed she could be if she grew up knowing her feelings mattered. She was the narrator in her school play, the kid who stood up to bullies, the friend other children sought out when they needed comfort. She was proof that being too emotional wasn't a weakness to overcome, it was a superpower to embrace. And sometimes late at night when she was sleeping peacefully in her own room, in our own home, surrounded by the security we'd built together, I would remember that day in the courtroom, when everything changed. I would remember the moment when Marcus's own evidence backfired, when his attempts to paint me as unstable revealed his own dysfunction, when my daughter's simple truth cut through years of manipulation and gaslighting. I would remember that being dismissed as too emotional had been the beginning of our freedom, not the end of our story. We were just exactly emotional enough, and that was exactly enough.